Rising 2,000 feet into the quiet, forested peaks of the Ozark Mountains in Carroll County, Arkansas, a beautiful stone fortress sits wrapped in morning mist, hiding a deeply terrifying secret behind its grand Victorian facades. To walk down its impeccably preserved, carpeted hallways in the dead of night is to invite an unsettling chill, a sudden drop in temperature that precedes something far worse than a simple draft. Without warning, the heavy silence of the third floor is often shattered by the distinct, unmistakable sound of a scream echoing from behind a locked, solid wooden door. It is not the cry of a fleeting apparition, but the residual, agonizing wail of a very real, very human suffering that soaked into the original pine floorboards and plaster walls during the darkest days of the late 1930s. Those echoing cries serve as the only remaining testament to the unspeakable medical horrors that were once inflicted within these elegant 78-room walls. Behind the imported Irish linens and the ornate Victorian wallpaper, patients were subjected to crude chemical injections and agonizing procedures without proper anesthesia, turning a place of supposed healing into a genuine house of torture. This towering limestone structure is the famous Crescent Hotel, located at 75 Prospect Avenue in Eureka Springs. Constructed in 1886 at a staggering cost of $294,000, the massive Richardsonian Romanesque building was designed by prominent architects to be a lavish, exclusive playground for the wealthiest elites of the American Gilded Age. Guests would arrive via the Frisco Railroad, transferring to horse-drawn carriages, dressed in fine silks, expecting nothing but opulent galas, sweeping valley views, and the absolute pinnacle of 19th century luxury. Offering Edison electric lighting, hydraulic elevators, and indoor bowling alleys, it was a monument to wealth and leisure, completely detached from the grim, everyday realities of illness and death. Yet the sheer grandeur of the sprawling resort would eventually become the perfect deceptive camouflage for a massive, highly organized criminal enterprise. The isolated mountain geography and the massive fortress-like stone walls allowed illegal operations to proceed in total secrecy, effectively hiding widespread medical abuse from the immediate scrutiny of state health authorities and federal medical boards. The lingering dread that saturates the 27-acre property today is not the result of ancient curses or standard campfire folklore, but is directly tied to one specific, incredibly dark era in its history. For a few agonizing years between 1937 and 1939, this grand vacation destination was twisted into a fake hospital operated by a disgraced radio broadcaster with no medical license and absolutely no conscience. The shock of this betrayal is profound, as hundreds of desperately ill patients were lured into the luxurious rooms of the Crescent, believing they had finally found genuine medical salvation. Instead of receiving palliative care, they were subjected to barbaric, agonizing experimental treatments that cost up to $500 a month, while their hopeful families waited obliviously in the opulent lobby below. To understand how such a massive, deadly deception could take root in this specific location, one must look at the foundational history of Eureka Springs itself. Long before the tragedy of the 1930s, the town became nationally famous because of the 63 natural cold springs flowing directly out of the surrounding limestone mountainsides, drawing thousands of desperate health seekers. Word spread rapidly across the country that these pristine waters possessed miraculous, divine properties capable of curing blindness, asthma, diabetes, and severe chronic diseases. The Crescent Hotel was explicitly built at the highest point in town, the crest of West Mountain, to serve as a grand, visible monument to this supposed miracle water, attracting those who could afford the ultimate healing retreat. The intense national belief in the curative power of the region created a perfect, highly lucrative environment for a predator to eventually exploit. Because Eureka Springs had already established a decades-long reputation as a legendary city of healing waters, it provided a ready-made, deeply trusting demographic of vulnerable patients who were already conditioned to expect medical miracles from the mountain air. The golden era of the healing springs could not last forever, and when the Great Depression ravaged the nation's economy after 1929, the once bustling luxury hotel completely failed, operating briefly as a women's college before leaving the massive stone building abandoned. Across America, millions of people were left not only financially ruined by the banking collapse, but utterly terrified by the unchecked spread of untreatable diseases. Cancer was a profound, inescapable death sentence during this era, long before the invention of targeted chemotherapy or advanced radiation treatments. The sheer desperation of families watching a loved one waste away from terminal carcinoma was unimaginable, and when conventional doctors offered nothing but a grim timeline for death, these terrified families were willing to sacrifice their last pennies, liquidating family farms for even a sliver of hope. This widespread climate of severe financial ruin and absolute medical terror provided the exact psychological vulnerability required for a massive fraud. The desperation of the Dust Bowl economy, combined with a distinct lack of federal oversight in rural medical practices, allowed snake oil salesmen to flourish unchecked, preying directly on the vulnerable populations of the American South and Midwest. Imagine the suffocating weight of being completely out of options, sitting beside a dying spouse or child, watching the light fade from their eyes day by day in a rural farmhouse. Then, imagine going to the mailbox and finding a beautifully printed multi-page flyer that promises a 100% guaranteed cure for cancer, requiring no painful surgery and no prolonged hospital stays. It is a fundamental flaw in human nature that when we are pushed to the absolute brink of despair, we will eagerly believe the most impossible, scientifically baseless lies. That flyer was not a medical breakthrough, but a carefully baited trap designed to drain the life savings from the dying, extracting thousands of dollars in hidden fees and forced room and board charges before they took their final breath. The architect of this monstrous, highly profitable scheme was a man named Norman Baker, a charismatic former vaudeville magician, theatrical mind reader, and relentless showman from Muscatine, Iowa, who possessed zero medical training. Baker was a master of public spectacle, famously stalking through the mountain town in bright purple suits, driving a customized purple car, and projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence that mesmerized his victims. He weaponized the newest mass communication technology of the era, the radio, to broadcast his booming voice directly into the living rooms of millions of frightened Americans. Operating his own powerful station, Baker confidently declared across the airwaves that the American Medical Association was lying to the public and that he alone held the secret painless chemical cure for cancer. Norman Baker, the flamboyant showman known for his signature lavender suits and aggressive broadcasts over his powerful radio station, had finally found the perfect stage for his ultimate deception. Driven out of Iowa by mounting legal troubles and medical authorities, the disgraced charlatan set his sights on the isolated, rugged terrain of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. In the summer of 1937, Baker purchased the decaying shell of the Crescent Hotel, a towering limestone monument to forgotten Victorian grandeur perched high above the Ozark Valley. Built originally in 1886 as a luxurious destination for the wealthy elite, the once majestic resort now stood completely empty, its grand halls echoing only with the mountain wind, until Baker arrived to transform its melancholic beauty into a highly profitable and grotesque medical empire. He immediately ordered the elegant carved wood and native stone to be covered in garish, unsettling colors, painting the balconies and trim in loud shades of purple, orange, and black, while loudly rebranding the historic sanctuary as the Baker Cancer Hospital. It was a deeply disturbing sight, a desperate coat of bright, theatrical paint attempting to mask the grim reality of the financial and physical harvest he was preparing to reap within those ancient walls. This newly painted circus-like facade was designed solely to project an illusion of cutting-edge medical triumph to a desperate nationwide public who had been told by legitimate physicians that their cases were entirely hopeless. Baker distributed thousands of glossy brochures depicting a lavish resort where terminal patients could supposedly relax their way to a guaranteed cure. Behind the freshly painted doors of the grand lobby, the terrifying truth of his guaranteed cure was quietly prepared in shadowed basement rooms. Baker's miraculous medicine, often referred to as Formula 5, contained absolutely no actual healing properties, consisting entirely of local Eureka Springs water, crushed watermelon seeds, corn silk, and a heavy, highly toxic dose of carbolic acid. Those who surrendered their life savings to sleep in the grand Victorian suites were immediately subjected to a brutal, agonizing daily regimen. Patients were literally injected with this raw carbolic acid directly into their tumors and veins, the caustic liquid burning violently into their fragile tissue under the false medical guise of actively burning away their malignant disease. To ensure his dark secret remained buried deep within the rugged terrain of the Ozark Mountains, Baker constructed an invisible, heavily guarded fortress around his vulnerable victims. The hospital operated under strict, unyielding operational rules, stripping every single patient of their personal autonomy and mobility the very moment they crossed the threshold of the front entrance. No one was permitted to leave the manicured grounds without a loyal staff member present, and the administration ruthlessly intercepted all communication with the outside world. Every single outgoing letter written by a suffering patient was opened, read, and heavily censored by Baker's employees, ensuring that only glowing reports of miraculous recoveries and excellent care ever reached their anxious families back home. The isolation imposed upon the residents was total and absolute, turning a sprawling mountain resort of supposed healing into an inescapable, silent prison. With no private telephones available in the nearest major cities hundreds of miles away, the sick and dying were entirely cut off from any independent medical evaluation or legal rescue. Trapped behind locked doors and the heavily monitored mailroom, the true nightmare of the Crescent Hotel began to unfold in the dark of night. The profound physical deterioration and severe mental suffering of the patients, many of whom were rapidly succumbing to acid poisoning rather than cancer, was swallowed completely by the thick limestone walls of the grand, opulent architecture. The historical record paints a chilling picture of patients lying in lavishly decorated Victorian bedrooms, entirely cut off from the ones they loved, while their own bodies literally burned from the inside out. The daily injections of carbolic acid actively ate away at their flesh and induced organ failure, leaving them to writhe in unimaginable agony without proper painkillers, all while the pristine exterior facade of the mountain resort remained completely undisturbed. The heavy velvet curtains, thick floral carpets, and solid oak doors of the 19th century construction effectively muffled the sounds of their nightly torment. This unintentional acoustic dampening kept the grim reality of the ongoing medical atrocities completely hidden from the bustling tourist town of Eureka Springs, situated in the valley far below the hotel. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire operation is how the families, receiving only carefully forged or heavily coerced letters, continued to empty their bank accounts while their loved ones slowly died. Relatives mailed thousands of dollars in currency to the Arkansas facility, demonstrating a blind, absolute faith in a charismatic radio personality who offered nothing but empty promises and fabricated medical charts. Yet, the chilling power of Norman Baker's syndicated radio broadcasts and his absolute, unwavering certainty preyed masterfully upon the deepest vulnerabilities of the human heart. His relentless anti-establishment rhetoric, constantly attacking the American Medical Association, created a powerful illusion that allowed desperate families to believe his lies and keep sending money, completely unaware that they were actively funding a remote house of horrors. The steady stream of cashier checks and wired funds arrived daily at the grand front desk, generating an estimated millions of dollars in revenue for the fraudulent doctor. This massive influx of wealth purchased absolutely no legitimate medical supplies, funding nothing but prolonged misery and agonizing deaths for the hundreds of trusting souls trapped in the suites upstairs. When the caustic acid injections finally took their inevitable physical toll and a patient's suffering could no longer be contained or kept quiet, they were forcibly moved to the most terrifying corner of the massive building. High up on the fourth floor, completely isolated from the grand lobby and the newly arrived patients, Baker established a heavily restricted zone that became known among the staff as the secret pain ward. If a resident became too visibly emaciated, or if their agonizing screams threatened to upset the new wealthy arrivals checking into the lobby downstairs, orderlies quietly relocated them to this hidden section using the service elevators. The fourth floor was an area meticulously designed not for palliative treatment or end-of-life comfort, but strictly for total, unyielding containment away from the eyes of the paying public. Once the heavy wooden doors of the upper floor closed behind them, those terminal patients were never seen by the outside world or their families again. They were left to expire in absolute isolation, their final agonizing hours unrecorded on any official medical chart, waiting only for the inevitable journey down to the secret basement morgue that Baker had constructed directly beneath the hotel. In the suffocating isolation of the hidden ward, the final days of Norman Baker's patients were a symphony of unimaginable torment. He offered no merciful elixirs, no morphine drips, and no soothing narcotics to ease the relentless agony of their failing bodies. Instead, patients suffering from advanced carcinomas were left to endure the final, agonizing stages of their terminal illnesses with absolutely zero palliative care. Instead of administering traditional medicine, Baker prescribed a grotesque and highly calculated distraction to mask the suffering. He installed heavy wooden radios throughout the sterile, echoing hallways of the cancer ward, intentionally turning the volume to a deafening pitch. These speakers blasted cheerful, upbeat broadcasting and lively big band melodies at all hours of the day, specifically calibrated to drown out the ceaseless cries of the dying. That jovial music continuously echoed off the cold institutional tiles, creating a cheerful, mocking mask pulled tightly over a waking nightmare of human decay. The stark contrast between the bright, booming radio announcers and the agonizing deterioration happening behind closed doors only amplified the profound psychological torture inflicted upon the trapped and deteriorating residents. But the true, absolute horror of the Crescent Hotel lay far beneath those brightly lit, musical corridors. Deep in the damp, subterranean belly of the building, Norman Baker had quietly transformed the old resort's expansive basement into a clandestine, fully functional morgue. This hidden facility was entirely sealed off from the luxurious upper floors where wealthy patrons still enjoyed their scenic mountain vacations. The cavernous underground rooms that once held fine dining provisions and the heavy steamer trunks of wealthy vacationers now housed a massive, chillingly sterile metal autopsy table. Beside this cold slab sat a heavy iron incinerator, a monstrous, soot-stained furnace waiting in the shadows to quickly and quietly consume the biological evidence of Baker's catastrophic medical failures and unauthorized surgical experiments. To maintain the lucrative illusion of a miraculous healing sanctuary, the mounting daily death toll had to remain an absolute secret from the paying guests residing just above the ward. The grim logistics of this deception required the hospital staff to strictly wait until the darkest hours of the night, long after the hotel lobby had emptied and the building had fallen into a restless sleep. Under the cover of profound darkness, loyal orderlies would quietly wheel the newly deceased out of the hidden wards, carefully maneuvering the lifeless bodies down the creaking service elevators and into the cold embrace of the secret basement. They operated with total silence, ensuring that the creaking wheels of the gurneys never disturbed the wealthy clientele sleeping just down the hall from the dying. It was a silent, strictly orchestrated nightly procession of the dead, systematically erasing all physical trace of the victims before the morning sun could expose the truth. By dawn, the emptied hospital beds were meticulously remade with fresh linens, ready to receive the next desperate arrival who had traveled hundreds of miles clutching a fraudulent brochure and a pocket full of their life savings. This calculated, institutional erasure strikes at the very heart of a primal, universal vulnerability, the absolute terror of placing our lives in the hands of a monster disguised as a medical savior. We are conditioned from birth to trust the absolute authority of a physician, to instinctively believe that the crisp white coat represents an unwavering sacred oath to do absolutely no harm to the vulnerable. When terminal illness strips away our physical strength and leaves us desperate for any shred of salvation, we willingly surrender our bodies, our entire life savings, and our fragile, desperate hope to these supposed healers. We sign over our autonomy, trusting that the medical professionals standing at the foot of our beds possess both the scientific knowledge and the moral compass required to save us. Norman Baker ruthlessly weaponized that sacred surrender, twisting the desperate, unwavering faith of the dying into an instrument of profound financial exploitation. He looked directly into the eyes of terrified families and promised them absolute miracles, knowingly draining their bank accounts while actively accelerating the demise of their loved ones through sheer neglect and toxic, untested chemical injections. Yet, a medical deception of this monumental scale could not be sustained in the shadows of the Ozark Mountains forever. The pristine facade of the Grand Hospital finally began to fracture as local medical professionals and regional health authorities started to notice the alarming, highly unnatural volume of pine caskets quietly leaving the small mountain town of Eureka Springs on outbound commercial trains. Whispers of the escalating atrocities quickly reached beyond the Ozark valleys, drawing the sharp, uncompromising gaze of federal postal inspectors in Washington. These relentless federal investigators began to meticulously dismantle Baker's sprawling empire of fraudulent mailings, carefully tracking the illicit flow of desperate money, false advertising pamphlets, and empty medical promises right back to the hotel's ornate, towering doorstep. The invisible net of federal justice was finally tightening around the self-proclaimed visionary as investigators gathered thousands of pages of documented evidence proving his absolute fraud. State medical boards and federal agents began coordinating a massive strike to permanently dismantle the entire operation and bring the fake doctor to justice. The ultimate breaking point arrived with sudden, shattering force in the autumn of 1939. Armed with undeniable documentary evidence of extensive mail fraud and practicing medicine without a valid license, a massive coalition of federal and state law enforcement officers descended upon the mountain, storming the grand estate to tear down the deadly illusion once and for all. Lead investigators pushed their way past the heavy carved wooden doors and the bizarre, vibrant purple decorations that Baker absolutely loved, forcefully halting the macabre medical operation that had consumed so many innocent lives. Agents immediately seized filing cabinets, locked down the hidden wards, and apprehended the staff members who had facilitated the massive cover-up. The grand, luxurious healing resort was abruptly transformed into a sprawling, chaotic crime scene. Federal agents cordoned off the grand lobby, turning the opulent vacation destination into an active investigation zone where every patient record, every financial ledger, and every hidden room was suddenly subject to intense governmental scrutiny. What the authorities ultimately discovered behind those locked ward doors was a landscape of unimaginable heartbreak, finding emaciated, suffering patients trapped in their sterile rooms. The most tragic revelation of all was not just their severe physical decay, but their deep, misplaced fury at the rescuing officers, for these dying souls still fiercely believed that Norman Baker was on the verge of curing them. Stepping into the shadowed corridors of the Crescent Hotel, investigators were met with a tableau of profound human suffering, a grim reality far removed from the grand resort it once was. Behind locked, heavy oak doors, they found the starving and the dying, their bodies ravaged not just by disease, but by the very treatments meant to save them. Yet, the most tragic revelation was not their physical deterioration, but the profound psychological manipulation they had endured. Many of these frail souls lashed out with surprising fury at their rescuers, their minds so completely captured by Norman Baker's insidious charm that they fiercely defended the man slowly killing them, utterly convinced he was their sole salvation. The scent of decay and antiseptic lingered heavily in the stale air, a haunting testament to the blind desperation that had tethered these victims to their grim fate. The ensuing legal battle systematically dismantled the facade of the miraculous healing sanctuary, dragging the horrors of the hidden pain ward into the unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. Prosecutors meticulously laid out the mechanics of the deception, exposing the toxic nature of the carbolic acid injections and the sheer brutality of the clandestine morgue located in the hotel's cavernous basement. The mechanism of the fraud was undeniable, a calculated exploitation of the vulnerable executed with chilling precision. However, the ultimate justice delivered felt like a hollow echo against the monumental scale of the tragedy. Despite the overwhelming evidence of widespread suffering and countless undocumented fatalities, the legal system could only convict the false doctor of mail fraud. The architect of this vast, lethal enterprise was sentenced to a mere 4 years in Leavenworth prison, a staggering disparity that left the grieving families without true vindication. This meager judicial consequence merely shifted the burden of the tragedy from the courtroom back to the silent, blood-stained halls of the abandoned hospital. A dark, insurmountable void still haunts the legacy of the Crescent Hotel to this day, an agonizing mystery centered on the true human cost of the deception. In the frantic hours before the authorities breached his domain, the charlatan meticulously incinerated his medical logs and patient registries, ensuring the complete erasure of his victims' identities. We know with absolute certainty that hundreds of hopeful souls perished within those stone walls, yet the exact number of the dead remains forever trapped in the ashes. The sprawling, overgrown grounds of the estate hold their secrets tightly, with unrecorded graves suspected to be scattered beneath the ancient oaks and crumbling terraces. This deliberate destruction of history ensured that generations of families would never know the final resting place or the agonizing final moments of their loved ones. The unsettling grip of this dark past violently intruded upon the modern world decades later, proving that the earth itself could not contain the horrors of the 1930s. On a remarkably ordinary afternoon in 2019, a landscaper was quietly working in the dirt just outside the hotel's pristine gardens. The mundane tranquility of the day shattered when his steel shovel struck something rigid and unnatural buried shallowly in the soil. Excavation of the site revealed a clandestine dumping ground, yielding a cache of hundreds of glass bottles and strange sealed containers hidden just out of sight. The archaeological recovery process required meticulous care as investigators cataloged the unearthed medical refuse, realizing they had stumbled upon a forgotten piece of the hospital's darkest operational procedures. This subterranean discovery bridged the gap between a historical nightmare and a tangible, terrifying present. The contents of those unearthed jars provided the most chilling revelation of the entire enduring mystery, a visceral glimpse into the mind of a predator. Floating in murky, amber-tinted formaldehyde were preserved human tissues, organs, and massive tumors that had been crudely excised from the living patients. These were not mere medical samples, but macabre trophies, grotesque specimens kept by a man who viewed human suffering as a mere byproduct of his grand, twisted experiment. The unearthing of these grim relics forced a modern community to confront the undeniable physical proof of the atrocities committed on their doorstep, permanently altering the legacy of the historic landmark. The forensic analysis of these preserved tissues finally provided the irrefutable scientific evidence of the lethal, agonizing treatments that had been administered in the name of a cure. Following the imprisonment of its darkest master, the massive stone structure sat abandoned for years, a decaying monument to shattered hope, before eventually being purchased and painstakingly restored to its former glory as a luxury resort. Yet, as fresh coats of paint covered the faded walls and elegant furnishings replaced the iron hospital beds, the atmosphere of the building refused to shed its melancholic weight. The new staff and arriving guests soon found themselves enveloped in an environment where the past bled seamlessly into the present, walking through opulent, restored hallways that still echoed with phantom footsteps and sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature. The structural transformation from a house of profound suffering back into a place of leisure seemingly acted as a catalyst, awakening the lingering, unresolved energies trapped within the limestone foundation. Today, those who walk the corridors after midnight frequently encounter the chilling remnants of the hospital era, most notably the sorrowful apparition of a nurse dressed in a crisp, white 1930s uniform. Guests report the profound, unsettling dread that washes over them as they watch her spectral figure silently pushing a phantom metal cart down the shadowed hallways, forever bound to a tragic routine of tending to the unseen, agonizing dead. To this day, the third floor of the hotel remains a domain where time seems to have fractured, trapping the echoes of Norman Baker's horrific reign. Guests and staff alike recount the chilling manifestation of a spectral nurse, forever bound to her grim duties. She appears in the dim corridors, clad in a pristine, starched white uniform straight from the late 1930s, her face obscured by the shadows of the past. The unmistakable rhythmic squeak of a heavy metal cart rolling across the wooden floorboards often precedes her arrival. a phantom sound that sends a visceral jolt of dread through anyone unfortunate enough to hear it. The exposure of the horrors within those limestone walls catalyzed a fundamental shift in how the American medical establishment pursued charlatans. Baker's unprecedented abuse of the postal system to lure dying patients across state lines forced federal authorities to sharpen their legal instruments. The government realized that local medical boards were utterly powerless against well-funded interstate predators who sold false hope through the mail. Consequently, the United States Postal Inspection Service established new, aggressive precedents for prosecuting medical fraud, using Baker's conviction as the definitive blueprint. The tragic loss of life in the Ozark Mountains proved that federal mail fraud statutes were the most effective weapon to dismantle unregulated, deadly medical empires. This institutional awakening permanently altered the landscape of consumer protection, ensuring that the unchecked broadcast of miracle cures would face the full, crushing weight of federal law. Yet, for the families who had surrendered their loved ones to the Crescent Hotel, these sweeping legal victories offered no solace, only the bitter ash of profound betrayal. They had drained their life savings, mortgaged their family farms, and traveled thousands of miles based on a meticulously crafted lie, only to receive a wooden box in return. The psychological devastation rippled through generations, leaving a permanent scar of guilt on those who believed they were buying salvation for their dying spouses and children. The town of Eureka Springs also bore a heavy, silent burden, forever marked by the dark stain of what had transpired on the mountain above them. Local workers who had been employed as maids, groundskeepers, and undertakers carried the quiet trauma of what they had witnessed, bound by a collective shame that took decades to unravel. They were the unwilling custodians of a terrible secret, forced to live with the memory of the desperate cries that had once echoed through the valley. The revelation of Baker's methods struck a devastating blow to the broader public's blind faith in alternative, unregulated sanatoriums during the mid-20th century. When federal investigators finally unsealed the horrifying medical records in 1939, the nation was forced to confront the lethal danger of charismatic healers operating outside the bounds of traditional science. The sheer scale of the deception shattered the prevailing assumption that rural, isolated health resorts were inherently safe havens for the chronically ill. This cultural awakening fundamentally changed the relationship between desperate patients and the burgeoning medical industry. The horrific findings documented by Postal Inspector Roy L. Kinney proved that a confident voice on the radio and a glossy brochure were often the masks of a predator. The tragedy in Arkansas became a grim, enduring warning, teaching the American public to view unverified medical miracles with deep, protective suspicion. Despite the extensive federal trials and the eventual shuttering of the hospital, a haunting void remains at the center of the historical record. A question that defies all investigation. The true, absolute number of souls who perished under Norman Baker's care at the Crescent Hotel has never been definitively established, because the charlatan meticulously controlled the flow of information, burning records and falsifying death certificates to hide his failures. The exact body count is lost to the shadows of the past. Researchers and historians are left to sift through fragmented train manifests, incomplete undertaker logs, and the desperate, unanswered letters of grieving families. We know the basement morgue was in constant, quiet operation, but the identities of countless victims who were shipped away in the dead of night remain unknown. This missing ledger of the dead ensures that the full, staggering scope of the tragedy will forever remain an unsolved puzzle buried beneath the hotel's foundations. The dark legacy of the building itself eventually birthed a unique cultural phenomenon, transforming a site of profound suffering into a cornerstone of dark tourism. As decades passed, the Crescent Hotel embraced its grim history, preserving the architecture and the chilling atmosphere rather than demolishing the physical evidence of the past. The preservation of the morgue, the autopsy table, and the eerie winding corridors established a new paradigm for how communities interact with their most unsettling historical landmarks. This institutional decision to confront rather than erase the darkness turned the property into a living museum of the macabre. It created a sanctioned space where the public could directly engage with the tangible remnants of historical trauma, ensuring the story of the false cures would never be forgotten. By maintaining the physical space where the tragedy unfolded, the hotel inadvertently constructed a permanent educational monument to the victims of medical deception. For the modern visitors who walk those restored hallways, the experience transcends mere historical curiosity, often evoking a profound, unsettling empathy for the forgotten dead. Standing in the very rooms where desperate patients spent their final agonizing days forces a visceral connection to the fragility of hope and the devastating cost of blind trust. The lingering sorrow of the space serves as a quiet, emotional anchor, reminding every guest that the ghosts of the Crescent are not just folklore, but the enduring echoes of real human suffering. Deep in the limestone belly of the mountain, the heavy iron door of Norman Baker's secret morgue still stands firmly in place, cold to the touch. It remains a silent, rust-stained monument to the desperate souls who walked into the Ozark Mountains searching for a miracle, only to find a monster waiting in the dark.